Hi, everyone. This is Casey Washington, Cassandra Washington from Teach and Take Time for You. And I wanted to come on for a few minutes. It's been a while. So I hope everyone's doing well. It's summertime, school's out for almost everyone, or it should be out for everyone. But I want to talk a little today about leadership trauma. And I kind of discovered that term recently. I was listening to a podcast with Principal Kafele and his guest, and they were discussing uh, their perspective of being a principal, and most were in either Title I schools or they started out in Title I schools or under-resourced schools, and the challenges of being the principal and challenges of getting things done and just the challenges of running a school and how they were really talking about it from uh, being a Black principal in that perspective too. But I found myself as a former principal agreeing with a lot of things that they were talking about, whether it was the joys, it was the successes, the failures, the hardships, the battles that you had to fight, or that you have to fight a lot of times as a principal, especially when you're in either underperforming or under resourced school. And I found myself just, like shaking my head, agreeing, like, wow, this stuff just kind of resonates with so many. And it resonated with me, even though I'm not a principal anymore. I'm retired, semi retired. But I kept thinking, God, I, being a principal can be traumatizing. And I don't mean it in a negative way. I'm thinking more about in um, thinking about our mental health as school leaders. So I was telling some other people, some colleagues, there's leadership trauma, and they kind of thought I made up the term. So I was like, okay, I'm a little geek, um, nerd, so I'm going to do some research on leadership trauma. So I did some research. A lot of times when you Google the term leadership trauma, a lot of times what came up was um, trauma informed principal or trauma informed leader, but that's not really what I was talking about or thinking about. So I did find something, but what I found was geared more toward business leaders and CEOs of big corporations. But I was like, well, we principals are like the CEO of their schools, right? You are the CEO, you're running things. And we have some of the same skill sets as people who run businesses. So we experience some of the same things that they do in their leadership role and in our leadership role. So I was like, okay, let me correlate how these components of leadership trauma, uh, how they correlate with being a school leader. So I did my research. I actually did a blog post on it. So for those of you who do read the blog, Teach and Take Time for You, it's www.teachandtaketime, the number 4, and the letter U, www.teachandtaketime for you.com. I did post it yesterday, so if you get a chance to read it, please do. Um, so, as you know, I was a principal, but the thing about leadership trauma, because there are certain types of trauma we all know, we've read about it. It's a big word in education right now. But usually, when you talk about trauma or chronic trauma, it's about past events, things that happened to a person in the past that affects them in the present day, either emotionally or physically, spiritually. But the thing about leadership trauma is that it's more about future events, that leaders have the anxiety and the fear of something happening in the future. So we can all kind of relate to that as principals, right? Because we are constantly worrying about the future test scores, the future budgets, the future school year, the next school year, what's going to happen. And sometimes it's that fear, the fear of failure. If I don't do things correctly, if I don't make the right decisions, that, it's going to have this trickle down effect, or, just this monstrous effect on all of your stakeholders, your students, your parents, your community members, your staff members. There's also that feeling of shame and humiliation. So these are the things that we fear that might happen in the future and affect our careers. So, for example, test scores are all the rage before the pandemic, right? And we were always under threat that if your test scores don't go up, you're going to lose your principal contract, and I know in my district it used to be, the fear and threat of closing the school, reconstituting the school, making sure you lose your job and all the teachers lose their job. And then, there might be this humiliation. If I make the wrong decision, I might end up on the news, or, I might lose my job because I thought what I did was right and it wasn't, and I was publicly humiliated. So, thinking about leadership trauma, think about those components: that fear of failure, fear of shame, fear of humiliation. And then there's that part of self blame. Because if things go wrong in the school, or there's something drastic, or something happens, we sometimes, as principals or assistant principals, we blame ourselves. So there's that self blame. I didn't make the right decision. So now my students are suffering. I didn't do the budget correctly. So now people are losing their jobs. All of those are just some examples. There are more, but I don't have that kind of time to go into it today live about that. But I'm encouraging people to do a little homework about leadership trauma and think about yourself and reflect yourself and whether or not you're experiencing it. All of us, all of us experience some kind of trauma. We're not immune, um, and while it may be worse for some than others, somewhere in your life you've experienced some kind of trauma. But in the leadership role, people find it hard to believe that you're experiencing some trauma because of that anxiety about things that may happen. Because you don't sleep at night worrying about um, things that go on in your school or in your district. You may be worrying about a particular kid, or if the school closes, what happens to my students? What happens to the families? If the budget is cut, what happens to my staff? I have to, lay off people, and I'm pretty much in charge of whether or not these people have a job, or whether or not they have a livelihood. All those things that keep you up at night. You know, do I have enough resources for this? If they don't do well on the test scores, it's going to reflect on me. Or if I don't get my contract renewed, that's a sign of some kind of humiliation to you, because your career has been damaged to a certain, may or not be damaged, but in your mind, you're thinking it's damaged because you weren't renewed. But this topic of leadership trauma is not discussed very often in the education setting. And part of it is that people don't really think it exists. But, when you reach that pinnacle, people look at you like, well, what do you have to complain about? You got a good salary. you ascended to that position that you wanted. So it can't be any pain and shame and humiliation when you're on the top, but that's not true. So I just want you all to think about leadership trauma and think about how it may be affecting you as a leader, as a school leader. I want to have more discussions about it. But if you want to go more in depth about it, I ask that you read my blog post, because I did go into more detail about it, or do your own homework. And the blog post is titled Leadership Trauma is Real. And you can find it at www.teach and take time, number 4, for you, the letter U. Teach and take time for you.com. I hope that we can talk more about this. I really want to push more about this so that people will get the kind of support they need when they're actually going through this leadership trauma, because you do need support. And we know that being a principal is a lonely job. It's a lonely job. And when you're going through leadership trauma, the last thing you need is to be kind of alone and thinking about all these things that are occurring, or all the things you're anxious about. You shouldn't be thinking about them by yourself. So, think about therapy, thinking about coaching. But I just want to put this topic on the radar. So that's all I have today. Leadership trauma. Let's keep talking about it, and let's keep helping our colleagues if they are going through something like that. And I hope to see you all soon. You all have a great and wonderful day. Take care.